Margaret Hayes was a woman of quiet dignity. At 62, she carried a warmth that drew people in, though her life had grown simpler over the years. She lived alone in a modest, two-story brick home on a tree-lined street in South Boston, a neighborhood that hummed with life but had grown quieter in recent times. The house reflected Margaret's character, cozy, neat, and full of memories. Framed photographs lined the walls, snapshots of her years as a beloved teacher in the local school system and cherished moments with her late husband, James, a Boston firefighter. James had been her rock, her partner in everything, until a sudden heart attack took him 5 years ago. Since then, Margaret had learned to navigate the world on her own, though it hadn't been easy. The laughter of children playing in the street sometimes reminded her of the family she and James never had, a thought she pushed aside as best she could. One chilly November morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee. Her eyes skimmed over the headlines, pausing briefly on a story about a recent string of burglaries in the area. She sighed and shook her head. South Boston wasn't what it used to be, she thought. Back when she and James had moved here in their 30s, the neighborhood had been tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. Lately, though, the news seemed to carry more tales of unease than camaraderie. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ring of her phone. "Margaret, it's Nancy," came the familiar voice of her lifelong friend. "You've been on my mind lately. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Nancy," Margaret replied, though she knew her friend wouldn't by the nonchalant tone. Nancy had a knack for sensing when Margaret was feeling down. "Margaret Hayes, I've known you since we were 10 years old. Don't find me. You need some company in that house of yours. Have you thought any more about getting a dog? You know, something to keep you on your toes." Margaret hesitated. The idea had crossed her mind. She loved dogs, but owning one felt like a big responsibility. "I don't know, Nancy. It's been years since I had a pet. And what if you find exactly what you need?" Nancy cut her off. "Go down to the shelter. Just look around. No pressure." By the time they hung up, Nancy had convinced her. 2 days later, Margaret found herself standing outside the Boston Animal Shelter, clutching her coat tightly against the brisk wind. The shelter was bustling with activity. Inside, the sound of barking filled the air, mingling with the chatter of staff and visitors. A kind-looking volunteer greeted Margaret at the door. "Looking for a new friend?" the young woman asked with a smile. "I suppose I am," Margaret replied, glancing around nervously. As the volunteer led her through the kennels, Margaret's eyes scanned the dogs. Some wagged their tails eagerly, others barked for attention. But one dog, a large German shepherd sitting calmly at the back of his kennel, caught her attention. His intelligent amber eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze, a mix of curiosity and wisdom, that stopped her in her tracks. "This is Max," the volunteer said. "He's about 6 years old. A bit of a mystery, really. He came to us a few months ago. No microchip, no tags. But he's incredibly well-trained and very gentle." Margaret knelt down by the kennel door. "Hello there, Max," she said softly. The dog tilted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. Slowly, he approached, pressing his nose against the bars. "Would you like to meet him?" the volunteer asked. Margaret nodded, her heart suddenly pounding. When the kennel door opened, Max walked out with a calm, measured gait. He stopped in front of Margaret and sat, looking up at her as if waiting for a command. Tentatively, she reached out her hand, and Max leaned into her touch. "He's perfect," Margaret whispered, almost to herself. That afternoon, Max came home with her. As she watched him explore her house, his movements deliberate yet relaxed, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Nancy was right. Maybe this was exactly what she needed. Later that evening, as they took their first walk together through the neighborhood, Margaret found herself talking to Max as if he were an old friend. "I think we'll get along just fine," she said, glancing down at him. Max looked up at her, his tail wagging gently, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt truly at ease. What she didn't yet know was that Max had a history, one that would soon turn her quiet life upside down. Over the weeks that followed, Margaret and Max settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with a brisk walk through the neighborhood, the air crisp and refreshing as they wandered past rows of historic brick townhouses. Max was an attentive companion, always walking slightly ahead, but constantly glancing back to ensure Margaret was keeping pace. At home, Max seemed to instinctively understand Margaret's rhythms. He would lie quietly by her feet as she read, occasionally lifting his head to observe her with those penetrating amber eyes. There was a calmness about him that Margaret found comforting. Yet there were moments when she noticed something more, a sharpness, a sense of awareness that seemed almost human. It wasn't until one afternoon, while Margaret was preparing lunch, that she got her first real glimpse of Max's extraordinary abilities. The sound of shattering glass sent a jolt of fear through Margaret. She dropped the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables and froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise had come from the back of the house. "Max," she called out instinctively. Before she could even process what was happening, Max was on his feet, his entire demeanor transformed. His relaxed posture stiffened, and his ears perked up as he moved swiftly toward the source of the sound. Margaret followed cautiously, clutching her phone in one hand, her finger hovering over the emergency dial button. When they reached the back door, Margaret saw the cause of the commotion. A stray basketball had crashed through one of the small glass panes. Standing just outside was a sheepish-looking teenager, his hands raised in a gesture of apology. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the boy stammered. "We were playing in the alley, and it just got away from us." Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she couldn't take her eyes off Max. The dog was standing perfectly still, his body positioned protectively in front of her. His eyes were locked on the boy, and his posture radiated control. It wasn't aggression. Max wasn't growling or barking. But there was an unmistakable intensity that made even Margaret hesitate. "It's okay, Max," she said softly, placing a hand on his back. Almost immediately, his muscles relaxed, and he stepped back, his tail wagging faintly as if to signal the situation was under control. The boy retrieved the ball, apologizing profusely, and Margaret reassured him that everything was fine. But long after the boy had gone, she couldn't stop thinking about how Max had reacted. It was more than instinct, it was training. That evening, Margaret decided to do some digging. Sitting at her computer with a cup of tea, she began searching for information about Max's possible origins. She remembered the shelter volunteer mentioning that he'd been found with no tags or microchip, yet his behavior suggested he wasn't just any stray. Her search led her down a rabbit hole of articles and forums about police and military working dogs. Many of the descriptions fit Max perfectly: the calm demeanor, the sharp awareness, the ability to assess and respond to potential threats. Margaret's curiosity grew into a nagging certainty. Max wasn't just an ordinary pet. The next morning, Margaret called the shelter. "I adopted a German Shepherd from you a few weeks ago," she told the volunteer. "His name is Max. Do you have any idea where he might have come from before he ended up with you?" The volunteer sounded apologetic. "Unfortunately, we don't have much information. He was picked up as a stray in Dorchester. No microchip, no collar. But you're not the first person to mention how unique he is." Margaret hung up, more intrigued than ever. She couldn't shake the feeling that Max had a story, one that someone, somewhere, had tried to leave behind. But as she watched him lying by the fireplace that evening, his eyes half closed and his breathing steady, Margaret decided she didn't need all the answers just yet. Whatever his past, Max was hers now, and for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. But Margaret's quiet sense of security was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. South Boston was changing. Once a tight-knit, family-friendly area, the neighborhood had seen an uptick in crime over the past few months. Reports of break-ins, car thefts, and even street muggings had left residents uneasy. The local news frequently warned citizens to stay vigilant and avoid walking alone after dark. Margaret, however, remained steadfast in her evening walks with Max. The air in the neighborhood was heavy with tension. Margaret noticed the change in her neighbors. Mrs. Callahan, who used to spend hours tending to her garden, now barely ventured outside. Mr. Alvarez, a retired mechanic, had installed new locks on his door and motion sensor lights around his property. Despite the unease, Margaret clung to her routine. The walks with Max had become her favorite part of the day, a chance to clear her head and feel connected to the world around her. Besides, with Max by her side, she felt invincible. The dog's steady presence and alert gaze made her believe that nothing could go wrong as long as he was there. One crisp evening, as Margaret was putting on her coat, her neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, called out to her from his porch. "Margaret, you sure it's a good idea to be out there this late?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Oh, I'll be fine," Margaret replied, waving him off. "Max here wouldn't let anything happen to me." Mr. Alvarez glanced at Max, who stood tall and alert at Margaret's side. "That's a good dog you've got there. But still, be careful. These streets aren't what they used to be." Margaret smiled and gave Max a pat on the head. "Don't worry, we'll be back before you know it." As they set off, the streets were quieter than usual. The familiar sound of children playing was absent, and most of the houses had their curtains drawn tight. The chill in the air seemed to carry a sense of foreboding. Margaret tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on Max. He trotted confidently beside her, his ears twitching at every faint noise. They walked their usual route, passing the corner store and the small park where she used to bring her students for picnics. Halfway through the walk, Margaret noticed a man standing on the opposite side of the street. He was leaning against a lamppost, his hands in his pockets, watching her. She tightened her grip on Max's leash. "Just keep walking," she muttered to herself, her heart beginning to race. Max seemed to sense her tension. His ears perked up and his pace slowed. When the man started to cross the street toward them, Max stepped in front of Margaret, his posture shifting from relaxed to protective. "Evening," the man said, his voice low and casual, but there was something unsettling in his tone. Margaret forced a polite nod and tried to step around him, but he moved to block her path. "Nice dog you've got there," he said, eyeing Max. "Bet he's worth a lot." Margaret's mouth went dry. "We're just out for a walk," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man chuckled, but it wasn't friendly. "You shouldn't be out here alone, lady. Dangerous neighborhood." Before Margaret could respond, Max let out a low, rumbling growl that sent chills down her spine. The man's smirk faltered as Max stepped forward, his body tense and his eyes locked on the stranger. All right, the man muttered, holding up his hands and backing away. "No need to get all worked up." Margaret didn't wait to see where he went. "Come on, Max," she said, her voice trembling. Together, they hurried back home, her heart pounding all the way. That night, as Margaret locked the doors and double-checked the windows, she couldn't shake the encounter. For the first time, she truly understood the gravity of what her neighbors had been feeling. But as she watched Max settle down by the fireplace, his watchful eyes never fully closing, she felt a glimmer of reassurance. Max wasn't just a companion. He was a protector. And in a neighborhood on edge, Margaret knew she would need him more than ever. The crisp November air carried a biting chill as Margaret stepped out for her evening walk with Max. The tension in the neighborhood lingered like an invisible fog, but Margaret refused to let fear dictate her life. She tightened her scarf around her neck and gave Max's leash a reassuring tug. "You ready, boy?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Max looked up at her, his amber eyes full of alertness, his tail giving a faint wag. Together, they began their usual route, the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet sidewalks. The first few blocks were uneventful, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves. Margaret's thoughts wandered as she walked, reflecting on how much her life had changed since Max entered it. His presence had filled her days with purpose, and for that, she was grateful. As they approached a narrow alleyway that cut between two rows of houses, Max suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and a low growl escaped his throat. Margaret froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it, Max?" she whispered, scanning the dimly lit street. She saw nothing out of the ordinary, but Max's reaction put her on edge. He moved closer to her, positioning himself protectively at her side. Before she could take another step, the shadows shifted. 3 figures emerged from the alley, their faces obscured by hooded sweatshirts. Margaret's pulse quickened as the men spread out, blocking her path. Well, What do we have here? One of them said, his voice dripping with mockery. Just a nice lady and her big OL dog. Another sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. Margaret took a step back, her grip on Max's leash tightening. I don't want any trouble, she said, her voice firm but shaky. Oh, we're not looking for trouble, the first man replied, taking a step closer. We just want a little something for our time. Maybe that purse you're holding. Margaret's stomach churned as she clutched her bag tightly. Please, just let us go, she pleaded. One of the men laughed. Or what? Your mutt's gonna stop us? That was their mistake. Max, who had been eerily silent, suddenly sprang into action. His deep, menacing growl erupted into a bark so fierce it echoed off the surrounding buildings. He lunged forward, his body taut and powerful, forcing the men to stumble back. Whoa, get that thing away, one of them shouted, his bravado crumbling as Max bared his teeth. The man closest to Margaret reached out, as if to grab her, but Max intercepted him with a precision that was almost mechanical. The dog's movements were calculated, his training unmistakable. He snarled and snapped, driving the man backward until he tripped and fell. Call him off, the leader yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Margaret, though terrified, found herself rooted in place, unable to look away. Max was no ordinary pet. He was a force of nature, his every move a testament to his extraordinary past. The second man tried to approach from the side, but Max turned on him with a swiftness that made Margaret's breath catch. With a deep bark and a sharp lunge, Max sent him scrambling back toward the alley. Let's get out of here, one of the men shouted, retreating into the shadows. The others quickly followed, their bravado shattered by the sheer force of Max's presence. As the men disappeared, Max stood his ground, his body still tense, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Slowly, his posture relaxed, and he turned to Margaret, his eyes softening as he nudged her leg gently. Oh, Max, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face as she knelt to embrace him. You saved me. By the time they reached home, Margaret's hands were still trembling. She locked the door behind her and sank into a chair, her mind racing. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, as if the night's events were nothing out of the ordinary. Margaret knew one thing for certain. Max was no ordinary dog. He was a protector, a guardian, and tonight, he had proven just how much she could rely on him. But the encounter had left her shaken, and she couldn't help but wonder, what if those men came back? And what else was Max capable of? Those questions would haunt her in the days to come, as the quiet streets of South Boston felt less and less secure. The events of that harrowing night had left Margaret shaken but resolute. For days, she replayed the attack in her mind, marveling at how Max had handled the situation. He had acted with such precision, such controlled intensity, that it was impossible to believe he was merely an ordinary dog. There was no doubt in her mind now. Max had been trained for something far greater than the average pet. Despite the fear that lingered, Margaret refused to let it consume her. She reported the incident to the police, who assured her they would increase patrols in the area. But the officers were just as intrigued by her story about Max as they were concerned about the attack. That's some dog you've got there, ma'am, one officer had said, crouching down to scratch Max behind the ears. I'd bet good money he's had professional training. Ever thought about looking into his background? Margaret had brushed the idea aside at the time, too overwhelmed by the ordeal to consider it. But now, as she sat in her living room, sipping tea with Max lying at her feet, she couldn't shake the thought. Who had Max been before he ended up in that shelter? And why had a dog with such remarkable skills been left behind? 2 weeks passed, and the neighborhood's tension only seemed to grow. News of Margaret's encounter spread quickly, and though it served as a warning to others, it also painted her as a target who had narrowly escaped harm. Margaret tried not to let the whispers bother her, but deep down, she felt the weight of it all. On an unusually cold evening, Margaret decided to take Max on a shorter walk than usual. The wind howled as they stepped outside, and the streets were eerily empty. The glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, and every rustle of leaves made Margaret's pulse quicken. As they turned a corner near the park, Max suddenly froze. His ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Margaret's heart sank. She followed Max's gaze and saw a man standing by a parked car, his hood pulled up and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't moving, but something about him felt off. Margaret gripped Max's leash tightly. "It's okay, Max," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. She tried to keep walking, but the man stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. "Evening," he said, his voice casual but laced with menace. Margaret stopped in her tracks. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. The man chuckled, glancing down at Max. "Relax, lady. Just thought I'd say hi to your dog. Looks like a real beauty. Bet he's worth something." Max let out a warning bark, his body tensing as he stepped protectively in front of Margaret. The man raised his hands mockingly, but before Margaret could respond, two more figures appeared from behind a nearby fence. "Looks like you brought backup," Margaret muttered, her fear giving way to a surge of anger. The man smirked. "Just want to have a little chat. No need to get all riled up." But Margaret didn't have to get riled up. Max did. With a sudden, fluid motion, he lunged forward, his bark echoing through the empty streets. The men froze, startled by the force of Max's presence. "What the hell?" one of them muttered, taking a step back. Max moved with the precision of a soldier. He circled Margaret, positioning himself between her and the men, his growls intensifying. When one of them tried to step closer, Max bared his teeth and let out a snarl so fierce that the man stumbled back, tripping over the curb. "Get that dog away!" another man shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Max didn't relent. His focus was absolute, his movements calculated. It wasn't just aggression, it was control. He was holding his ground, defending Margaret without escalating the situation unnecessarily. All right, we're leaving," the leader shouted, raising his hands in surrender. The men turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Margaret stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Max remained alert, his ears twitching as he scanned the area for any further threats. When he was satisfied they were alone, he turned to Margaret, his eyes softening as he nudged her hand with his nose. "Oh, Max," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his thick fur. "You're incredible. You saved me again." As they hurried home, Margaret's mind raced. There was no denying it anymore. Max was unlike any dog she had ever known. Whatever his past, it had made him into the protector he was today. Margaret resolved to find out the truth about Max, no matter what it took. But she also knew one thing for certain. Max wasn't just a part of her life now. He was her guardian, her defender, her hero, and she would do everything she could to keep him safe, just as he had done for her. The encounter on the street had shaken Margaret to her core, but she was determined not to let fear dictate her life. For the next few days, she avoided her evening walks, opting instead to spend time with Max in her fenced backyard. Despite the change in routine, Max remained vigilant, his amber eyes scanning their surroundings as if anticipating trouble. It was on a quiet Saturday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, that trouble found them again. Margaret had just finished washing the dinner dishes when she heard Max's low growl from the living room. She dried her hands quickly and walked toward him, her heart sinking when she saw his stance. He was rigid, his ears perked and his gaze locked on the front door. "What is it, Max?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and deliberate. Margaret's breath caught. It was unusual for anyone to visit her unannounced, especially after dark. She hesitated before moving toward the door, but Max stepped in front of her, his growl growing deeper. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking slightly. "Open up, ma'am. It's the police," came a gruff voice from the other side. Margaret frowned, her instincts telling her something was off. She glanced out the peephole but saw only shadows. "If you're the police, why didn't you call first?" There was a pause, and then the same voice replied, "Ma'am, we need to talk to you about a report you filed a few weeks ago. It's important." Margaret's grip tightened on the doorframe. She didn't believe them for a second. "I'll call the station to confirm," she said, backing away from the door. "Don't bother!" Another voice shouted, and suddenly, the door shook violently as someone tried to kick it in. Margaret screamed, but Max was already moving. He barked ferociously, his body pressed against the door as if to hold it closed. "Call 911!" A voice in her mind screamed, and she rushed to grab her phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed, the sound of splintering would filling the air. The door gave way, and 3 men burst into the house, their faces partially obscured by scarves. Max met them head-on. His bark echoed through the small living room, his presence like a force of nature. "Control the dog," one of them yelled, but Max was unstoppable. The first man swung a crowbar, but Max ducked and lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. The intruder screamed, dropping the crowbar as Max wrestled him to the ground. The second man tried to grab Margaret, but she screamed and threw a lamp at him, the glass shattering on impact. Max released the first man and turned his attention to the second, his growls so fierce they seemed to rattle the walls. The third man, clearly panicked, pulled a knife. "Get back, dog!" he shouted, waving the blade in the air. "Max, no!" Margaret cried, her voice breaking. But Max didn't charge blindly. Instead, he positioned himself between Margaret and the man, his body a shield. The knife-wielding intruder hesitated, unnerved by Max's unwavering focus. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the standoff. The men exchanged panicked glances before bolting out the door, leaving their injured accomplice behind. Max chased them to the edge of the yard, barking loudly until they disappeared into the night. When the police arrived minutes later, they found Margaret shaking but unharmed and one of the intruders writhing on the floor, his arm bleeding from Max's bite. "Ma'am, are you all right?" an officer asked as he stepped inside. Margaret nodded, clutching Max's collar. "He saved me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Max saved me again." The officer knelt down to inspect Max, who stood tall and calm, his demeanor no longer aggressive but watchful. "He's incredible," the officer murmured. "I've seen trained K9s, but this is something else." The man Max had subdued was taken into custody, and an investigation was launched to find his accomplices. But for Margaret, the ordeal left her with a newfound sense of both fear and gratitude. Max wasn't just her protector. He was a hero, and she knew now, more than ever, that his past held secrets that needed uncovering. As she sat with Max that night, stroking his fur and whispering words of thanks, Margaret resolved to find out who had trained him and why he had ended up in her care. The answers, she suspected, would change everything. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. She peered out the window and saw a police cruiser parked outside, its lights off. 2 uniformed officers emerged, one holding a file and the other carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Max, already alert, rose from his place by the fireplace and padded to the door, his ears perked and his stance steady. Margaret opened the door cautiously, Max standing protectively by her side. The officers greeted her with warm smiles, though their faces carried the weariness of a long shift. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes," said the older officer, whose badge read Sergeant Peterson. "We wanted to check in on you after last night's incident. Mind if we come in?" Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Max followed them closely, his sharp gaze never leaving the newcomers. "Quite a dog you've got there," the younger officer remarked, kneeling to extend a hand to Max. The German shepherd sniffed him briefly but didn't relax. The officer chuckled. "Still on duty, huh?" Margaret offered a nervous smile as she gestured for them to sit. "He's special, that's for sure. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been here." Sergeant Peterson pulled a folder from under his arm and placed it on the coffee table. "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," he said, leaning forward. "After hearing your account and seeing how Max handled himself, we did some digging." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Digging?" Peterson nodded. "We ran his description through a database we maintain for service and retired K9s. We don't always get matches, but in this case, we hit gold. Max here," he said, gesturing to the dog, "isn't just any German shepherd. His real name is Titan, and he's a retired K9 from the Boston Police Department. Margaret's mouth fell open. A police dog? She repeated, glancing at Max, who now seemed even more imposing. Yes, Peterson continued. Titan was part of our tactical unit for years. He specialized in high-risk operations, search and rescue, suspect apprehension, and even bomb detection. He had an impeccable record, saved countless lives, and earned several commendations. Margaret shook her head, trying to process the information. But how did he end up at a shelter? The younger officer, Officer Lewis, chimed in. K9s usually retire to their handlers, but Titan's case is a bit complicated. His handler, Officer Paul Gardner, passed away in an accident about 2 years ago. Without a family to take him in, Titan was placed in a temporary home, but it looks like he somehow got lost or abandoned. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at Max, or Titan, as she now knew him. So he's been through all of this, and now he's here. Peterson nodded solemnly. It's rare for a dog like him to end up in civilian hands, but it seems like fate brought you two together. The officers stayed for a while longer, answering Margaret's questions about Max's past and explaining the extensive training he had undergone. They offered to take him back if she felt overwhelmed, but Margaret refused. No, she said firmly, placing a hand on Max's head. He's part of my family now. Whatever his past, he's here with me. Peterson smiled. I figured you'd say that. You've got yourself one heck of a partner, Ms. Hayes. Just know that if you ever need anything, or if you want to enroll him in some refresher training, we're here to help. As they left, Margaret stood by the window, watching the cruiser disappear down the street. She looked down at Max, who was sitting calmly by her side, his gaze fixed on her. Well, Titan, she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue. Looks like you've got quite the story, and I guess we're just getting started. Max wagged his tail gently, his eyes warm and steady. Margaret knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his strong neck. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she could face them, because Max wasn't just her protector. He was a hero, and now, he was her hero. The days following the police visit were a whirlwind of emotions for Margaret. The revelation about Max, or Titan, had reshaped the way she viewed him. He was no longer just the loyal dog who had filled the void in her life. He was a highly trained professional with a decorated past. The realization left her awestruck, but it also filled her with questions. Determined to learn more, Margaret reached out to the Boston Police Department. Sergeant Peterson connected her with Officer Mike Simmons, a retired K9 trainer who had worked closely with Titan during his active years. They arranged to meet at a nearby park, where Margaret hoped to piece together more of Max's story. The park was quiet that morning, the autumn leaves crunching under Margaret's boots as she walked toward the bench where Officer Simmons waited. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with a kind smile and an unmistakable air of authority. At his feet sat an aging Labrador, who wagged its tail lazily at the sight of Margaret and Max. Miss Hayes, Simmons greeted warmly, extending a hand. And this must be Titan. Margaret shook his hand and smiled nervously. I suppose so, though I've been calling him Max. He doesn't seem to mind. Simmons chuckled. They're adaptable like that. Names don't matter as much to them as trust does. As they sat, Simmons studied Max with a mix of admiration and nostalgia. I remember when Titan first came into the program, he began. He was just a pup, but you could tell right away he was special. Smart, fearless, and incredibly loyal. He took to training like he was born for it. Margaret listened intently as Simmons described Max's years of service. He recounted missions where Max had located missing children, disarmed dangerous suspects, and even detected explosives during high-profile events. Each story painted a picture of a dog with unmatched skill and courage. But it wasn't just his abilities that made him exceptional, Simmons said, his tone softening. It was his bond with his handler, Paul Gardner. Those two were inseparable. Margaret felt a pang of sadness. I heard about Officer Gardner. It must have been devastating for Mac. It was, Simmons admitted. When a handler passes, it's like losing a part of themselves. Titan went into a sort of depression after Paul's death. We tried to reassign him, but he wasn't the same. Eventually, we decided it was best for him to retire. Margaret looked down at Max, who was lying by her feet, his head resting on his paws. She reached out to stroke his fur, her voice barely above a whisper. And then he ended up in a shelter. Simmons sighed. It's not uncommon, unfortunately. Without a designated home, retired K9s can fall through the cracks. But it seems to me like he ended up exactly where he was meant to be. As their conversation continued, Simmons offered to test Max's training to see how much he remembered. Margaret agreed, curious to see her dog in action. Simmons stood and gave a series of commands in a sharp, authoritative tone. Sit. Down. Stay. Max responded immediately, his movements precise and fluid. Simmons then walked a few yards away and tossed a small object into the grass. Retrieve. Max darted forward, his body moving with a speed and efficiency that left Margaret breathless. Within moments, he returned, the object clutched gently in his jaws. He's still got it, Simmons said with a grin. And judging by how he protects you, I'd say his instincts are as sharp as ever. Margaret couldn't help but smile, pride swelling in her chest. He's amazing, she said softly, scratching behind Max's ears. I'm so lucky to have him. You're not just lucky, Ms. Hayes, Simmons replied, his tone serious. You're exactly what he needed. Dogs like Titan don't just need a job, they need a purpose. And from what I can see, you've given him that. That night, as Margaret sat by the fireplace with Max at her side, she reflected on everything she'd learned. Max had been through so much: training, service, loss, and yet he remained steadfast and loving. She couldn't change his past, but she could ensure his future was filled with care and companionship. I don't know what I did to deserve you, she whispered, resting her hand on his head. Max lifted his gaze to hers, his eyes full of warmth and trust. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Margaret knew they would face them together. Max had found his purpose again, and Margaret had found her protector, her companion, and her reason to feel safe in a world that often felt uncertain. Word of Max's bravery and his remarkable past as a police K9 spread quickly through South Boston. Margaret found herself at the center of a newfound sense of community, as neighbors who had once kept to themselves began to reach out. People wanted to meet the heroic dog, to hear the story of how he had protected Margaret, and to share their own fears and hopes for the neighborhood. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly connected to those around her. It was as if Max had awakened something dormant in the community, a collective courage that had been buried beneath fear and isolation. On a brisk Saturday morning, Margaret hosted a neighborhood gathering in her backyard. She had initially been hesitant about the idea, but her friend Nancy insisted it was a chance to bring people together and celebrate Max. The yard buzzed with activity as families arrived, carrying baked goods and folding chairs. Children ran around, their laughter filling the air, while adults mingled, sipping coffee and cider. Margaret stood near the garden, greeting her guests and introducing Max to anyone who wanted to meet him. "Is this the famous Max?" asked Mrs. Callahan, the elderly woman who lived 3 doors down. She had rarely left her house in recent months, but today she seemed radiant, her hands outstretched to greet the German shepherd. "He certainly is," Margaret replied with a smile. "And he's happy to meet you." Max, ever the gentleman, sat calmly as Mrs. Callahan knelt to pet him. "What a fine dog," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You know, I used to be afraid to walk to the corner store. But knowing Max is in the neighborhood makes me feel safer already." Margaret's heart swelled. She glanced around the yard, seeing neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now laughing and sharing stories. It was a sight she hadn't realized she missed so deeply. As the morning progressed, Sergeant Peterson arrived with a surprise for Margaret and Max. He carried a small plaque, the words engraved in bold lettering. "In honor of Max, a true guardian of South Boston. This is for you both," Peterson said, handing it to Margaret, "for reminding us all what bravery and loyalty look like." Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she accepted the plaque. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Max has given me so much more than I could ever give him. He's brought me, and this neighborhood, back to life." The crowd clapped and cheered, and Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Max stood beside her, his tail wagging gently as if he understood the importance of the moment. The gathering marked a turning point for the neighborhood. Inspired by Max's story, residents began taking proactive steps to improve safety and rebuild trust. They organized a community watch program, hosted regular block meetings, and even worked with local law enforcement to install better lighting and security measures in high-risk areas. Margaret found herself at the heart of these efforts. Her once quiet life had become busy and fulfilling as she worked with her neighbors to create a sense of unity and shared purpose. And through it all, Max remained by her side, his presence a constant reminder of the strength and resilience they all shared. One evening, as Margaret walked Max through the neighborhood, she noticed something remarkable. People were outside, chatting on porches, walking their dogs, and watching their children play. The streets, once empty and foreboding, now felt alive with a renewed sense of hope. Margaret paused near the park, taking it all in. Max sat beside her, his gaze steady as he watched the world around him. "You did this," she said softly, looking down at him. "You brought us all back together." Max tilted his head, as if listening, and gave a soft bark of acknowledgement. Margaret laughed, her heart full. In that moment, she realized Max's legacy wasn't just about his past as a police canine or his acts of heroism. It was about the way he had inspired those around him to stand together, to protect one another, and to find strength in unity. And for Margaret, that was the greatest gift of all. Months passed, and life in South Boston transformed in ways Margaret could never have imagined. The streets that once felt unsafe now brimmed with activity. Children played freely, elderly neighbors ventured out for walks, and a sense of camaraderie permeated the community. Margaret and Max had become local icons, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog. But with Max's story spreading far beyond their neighborhood, Margaret found herself at the center of a wave of attention. Reporters from local newspapers and television stations reached out, eager to feature the retired K9-turned-neighborhood hero. At first, Margaret hesitated. She had always valued her privacy, but she couldn't deny that Max's story deserved to be told. One sunny afternoon, a young journalist named Emma came by to interview Margaret. She brought a small camera and a notebook, her excitement evident in the way she fidgeted with her pen. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Ms. Hayes," Emma said as she set up her equipment. "Max's story has really touched a lot of people." Margaret glanced at Max, who was lying by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on her. She smiled and nodded. "He's touched my life more than I could ever put into words." As the interview began, Margaret recounted everything. From the day she adopted Max to the night he protected her from the armed men. She spoke about the fear she had felt, the courage Max had shown, and the sense of purpose he had brought to her life. Emma listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "It's incredible how much impact he's had. Not just on you, but on the whole community," she said. "Do you think he knows?" Margaret chuckled, reaching out to scratch Max behind his ears. "I think he knows he's loved. And maybe that's all that matters." When the interview aired, it sparked a wave of responses. Letters poured in from across Boston and beyond. People who had faced challenges and found inspiration in Max's story. Families shared pictures of their own dogs. Children sent drawings of Max, and donations to local animal shelters surged. Margaret was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but it reaffirmed what she had always known. Max was special. One evening, Margaret received a call from the Boston Police Department. They invited her and Max to a special ceremony honoring Max's service and his contributions to the community. Margaret hesitated at first, unsure if Max would feel comfortable in such a public setting, but when she looked into his steady eyes, she decided it was the right thing to do. The ceremony took place in a grand hall at the precinct. Officers, neighbors, and local officials gathered to celebrate Max's legacy. Margaret stood beside him, her hand resting on his back as the chief of police stepped forward to present an award. Max, or Titan as many of us knew him, exemplifies what it means to be a protector, the chief said, his voice steady with emotion. Even in retirement, he has continued to serve, saving lives, bringing communities together, and reminding us all of the power of loyalty and courage. Tonight, we honor him not just as a K9, but as a hero. The crowd erupted into applause as the chief handed Margaret a medal, engraved with the words, "Max, a true guardian." Tears welled in her eyes as she knelt beside Max, holding the medal up for him to see. "This is yours, Max," she whispered. "You've earned it 100 times over." Max licked her hand gently, his eyes full of the quiet wisdom that had come to define him. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its steady rhythm. Margaret and Max continued their walks, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Though the world outside her door seemed brighter and safer, Margaret knew it wasn't just because of Max's heroics. It was because of the way he had brought people together, showing them what it meant to protect and support one another. As Margaret sat by the fireplace one evening, Max at her feet, she reflected on how much had changed. She had started this journey thinking she was rescuing a dog, but in truth, he had rescued her, and so many others along the way. "You'll never know how much you've given me," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers, and wagged his tail gently. Max's legacy wasn't just about the medals or the stories people told. It was about the lives he had touched and the love he had shared. And as Margaret drifted off to sleep that night, Max lying protectively at her side, she knew his story would live on, not just in South Boston, but in the hearts of everyone who had been inspired by his courage and devotion. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment "I watched this far" and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's really exciting.